The unexpected call. It was a quiet morning in the small town of Willowbrook. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light through the curtains of Richard Manning's house. He had been retired for nearly 5 years. As a lawyer, he had spent most of his life in the courtroom, solving cases, defending people, and ensuring justice. Now he enjoyed his free time. He spent his days reading, fishing by the lake, and taking long walks in the park. The phone had not rung much since he retired, and he was content with the peaceful life he had built. But today was different. Richard was sitting at his kitchen table, sipping his morning coffee when the phone suddenly rang. It was an unusual sound. It wasn't the regular call from a friend or family member. This one had a certain weight to it, as if it carried an important message. He hesitated for a moment, staring at the phone. Was it a wrong number? Or perhaps someone calling about something trivial? But then he picked it up. "Hello," he answered. "Richard," came the voice on the other end. It was a voice he knew very well, a voice that brought back memories of his long career as a lawyer. It was Michael Gray, an old acquaintance from his law firm days. Michael was a younger man, once an ambitious lawyer with big dreams. But now Michael was working as a public defender in a nearby city. "Michael, it's been a long time. How are you?" Richard replied, surprised to hear from him. "I'm good, Richard, but I need your help," Michael said. His tone was serious, and Richard could tell something was wrong. "Of course. What's going on?" Richard asked, his curiosity piqued. "I'm handling a case, Richard. A tough one. I'm in over my head," Michael began. "The problem is I'm not sure how to approach it, and I need someone with more experience." Richard felt a rush of concern. He had not heard Michael sound so serious before. Michael was always confident, always sure of himself. For him to ask for help meant the case was something big, something complicated. "Tell me more. What's the case?" Richard asked, his mind already shifting into lawyer mode. "There's a man, James Harper. He's been accused of a terrible crime," Michael explained. "He's accused of murder, Richard. But here's the thing. He's guilty." Richard frowned. It was rare for a lawyer to openly say that their client was guilty. Lawyers were trained to defend their clients, no matter the circumstances. They were supposed to argue for justice, even if it meant defending someone who had committed a crime. But Michael was being unusually honest. "You're sure he's guilty?" Richard asked, his voice calm but filled with curiosity. "Yes," Michael replied. "I've seen the evidence. I've spoken to him. He did it. But here's the twist. He's a good person, Richard. He made a terrible mistake, but he doesn't deserve to spend the rest of his life in prison." Richard paused, trying to understand the situation. He had seen many clients over the years, some guilty and some innocent, but he had never been in a situation where someone knew they were guilty and still wanted help. "Why are you asking me for help, then?" Richard asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. "If he's guilty, what can I do for him?" "I need you to help me find a way to make sure he doesn't go to prison for the rest of his life," Michael said. "I'm trying to build a defense, but I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to convince the court that he deserves a second chance. That's where you come in. I need your experience, Richard. You know how to work with tough cases. You know how to find the truth and present it in a way that could change everything." Richard sat back in his chair, thinking carefully. He had always been a man of principles. As a lawyer, he had spent years fighting for justice, for the innocent, and for those who needed a chance. But he had also seen the darker side of the law. He knew that not everyone who came through the courtroom doors was a victim. Some were criminals, and they needed to be held accountable for their actions. But this case was different. Michael was not asking him to defend someone who was innocent. He was asking him to defend someone who was guilty. It wasn't an easy decision. Richard had retired for a reason. He was tired of the long hours, the constant pressure, and the emotional toll that came with being a lawyer. But something in Michael's voice told him that this was a case that he couldn't ignore. Perhaps it was a chance to do something that mattered one last time. "All right," Richard said slowly. "I'll help you, but I need to understand the full picture. What happened with this man, James Harper?" Michael explained further. James Harper was a family man, a husband and a father. He had been living in Willowbrook for many years and had built a good life for himself and his family. However, he had recently lost his job and had been struggling to make ends meet. His marriage was on the rocks, and his personal life was in shambles. One night, in a fit of anger, he had gotten into an argument with his wife, something that had been building up for months. The argument had escalated, and in a moment of rage, James had killed his wife. The evidence was clear. There were fingerprints, witnesses who heard the argument, and even a confession from James himself. But Michael believed that James wasn't a criminal by nature. He had been overwhelmed by his circumstances and had made a terrible mistake. Michael wanted to try to get James a reduced sentence, something that would allow him to seek redemption rather than being locked away for the rest of his life. Richard felt a heavy weight on his shoulders. He had spent his entire career defending people who were accused of crimes. Some were innocent, some were guilty, but all of them had deserved a fair trial. This case, however, was different. James Harper was guilty, but Michael's words had struck a chord with him. Maybe James deserved a second chance. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to this story than just the crime he had committed. "I'll take the case," Richard said finally, his voice firm. "But we're going to do this the right way. We'll make sure that justice is served, even if it means a difficult road ahead." As Richard hung up the phone, he felt a sense of determination settle in his chest. He may be retired, but this case would be his final fight, and he was ready for it. This is the beginning of Richard's journey back into the world of law. In the next part of the story, Richard will face the challenges of defending someone he knows is guilty, and he will have to confront his own sense of justice and morality. The path to redemption. The following days were filled with a whirlwind of activity. Richard had not expected to dive into the world of law so quickly after his retirement. But when Michael called for help, he had made a promise. Now, he found himself standing at the edge of a very delicate situation. Richard knew he had to meet James Harper, the man at the center of this case. Michael had given him the basics. James had killed his wife in a moment of anger, but he was not a cold-blooded murderer. Richard needed to see the man for himself, to understand his emotions and motivations. Could there be more to the story? Could there be a way to lessen the impact of his crime? Or was it a simple case of justice needing to be served? Richard arranged to meet James at the local jail. As he drove there, his mind raced. He had never defended a guilty person before, at least not someone who had admitted to their crime from the start. There were always options, always angles to work, but this time there was no mystery. The facts were clear. James Harper had killed his wife. The question was, could Richard find a way to help him? When he arrived at the jail, Richard was greeted by a guard who led him to a small, sterile interview room. James was already waiting, sitting at the table with his hands folded in front of him. He looked older than his 35 years, his face gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes. There was a sadness to him, an overwhelming sense of regret that Richard could sense from the moment he walked in. James stood up as Richard entered. His movements were slow and uncertain, as if he wasn't sure how to interact with the man who had come to help him. "Mr. Manning," James said softly, "thank you for coming. I know I don't deserve it, but I need help." Richard nodded, offering him a seat. "You're welcome. I'm here to listen, James. I'm not here to judge. I just need to understand what happened." James sat back down, his eyes downcast. "It's all my fault. I should have never let things get so bad, but I was under so much pressure. My job, my marriage, everything just kept falling apart. I couldn't take it anymore." Richard watched James carefully, his fingers tapping gently on the table. He had seen many guilty clients over the years, but something about James's demeanor struck him. This wasn't the typical hardened criminal. This was a man who had made a tragic mistake, a man who had been pushed to the brink and lost control. "Tell me what happened that night," Richard asked, his voice calm but firm. James took a deep breath, as if preparing to relive the worst night of his life. "It started as any other night. My wife Claire and I had been arguing for weeks. The money, the kids, the house. It was all too much. We weren't talking to each other anymore. I was losing everything, Richard. My job, my self-respect, my family. Claire didn't understand. I kept telling her I was doing my best, but she didn't believe me. And that night, it was different. We started fighting again, and I just couldn't control myself. I snapped. I never meant to hurt her, but I did." James paused, his eyes filling with tears. Richard could see the torment in his face. This wasn't a man who had planned to kill. This was a man who had made an irreversible mistake. "I grabbed a knife. I don't even remember doing it," James continued. "It was like I wasn't even in my own body. One minute I was yelling at her, and the next, she was lying there on the floor. I don't even remember stabbing her. It's like everything went black for a moment, and when I came to, she was dead." Richard could feel the weight of James's words. He wasn't lying. This wasn't a cold, calculated murder. This was a crime of passion, a crime committed in the heat of the moment. But the law didn't care about emotions. The law cared about facts, and the facts were clear. James had killed his wife, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. "So, what happened after that?" Richard asked gently. James looked up at him, his eyes filled with shame. "I didn't know what to do. I panicked. I tried to clean up, to hide what I'd done. But there was no way to hide the truth. The blood, the marks on her neck, the knife. It was all right there. And then the police came. They found me sitting in the kitchen, staring at the wall. They knew it was me. I didn't even try to fight it. I confessed, right there. I didn't want to lie. I didn't want to make things worse." Richard sat back in his chair, thinking deeply. This was a complicated case. James was guilty, no question about it. The law demanded that he be punished for what he had done. But could there be a way to reduce the punishment? Could Richard find a way to show that James's actions weren't entirely driven by malice, that there was more to his story than just a senseless act of violence? "James, I'm going to help you," Richard said after a long pause. "But we need to be honest with the court. We can't pretend you didn't do it. What we need to focus on is why it happened and what kind of person you really are. You made a horrible mistake, but that doesn't mean you're beyond redemption." James nodded, a small glimmer of hope in his eyes. "You really think there's a chance?" "I don't know yet," Richard replied honestly, "but I'm going to do everything I can. We need to show the court that you didn't plan this, that you're not a murderer at heart. You're a man who made a terrible mistake, and you deserve a chance to make things right." James's face softened, and for the first time since Richard had walked into the room, he allowed himself to hope. As Richard left the jail, he felt a deep sense of responsibility. He wasn't sure if he could change the outcome of the case, but he knew he had to try. The law was clear, but sometimes the law didn't account for the whole story. James Harper wasn't a cold-blooded killer. He was a man who had lost control, and Richard believed he deserved the opportunity to atone for his actions. The next few weeks would be filled with difficult decisions, intense legal battles, and tough questions. But Richard was determined. He had one last case to fight, and this time the battle wasn't just about the law. It was about finding justice for a man who had made a terrible mistake. In the final part of the story, Richard will face the challenges of the courtroom, navigating the legal system, and fighting for a man who, despite his guilt, might deserve a second chance. The final verdict. The weeks that followed were filled with preparation. Richard worked closely with Michael, combing through every piece of evidence, every statement, and every detail of James's life leading up to the crime. The case was a challenge. The prosecution had a strong case, clear evidence, a confession, and witnesses who could testify to the violent argument that had taken place. But Richard wasn't ready to give up. There had to be a way to make the court see that James Harper wasn't just a murderer. He was a man who had lost control, a man who had made a tragic mistake. Every night, Richard sat at his desk, reviewing the case files. He could feel the weight of the decision he was about to make. This wasn't just another trial. This was his final case, the last time he would fight in a courtroom. And the stakes were high, not just for James, but for Richard himself. He had to know that whatever the outcome, he had done his best. Michael was an invaluable help, but Richard knew he was carrying the heavy load. Michael's expertise in public defense was useful, but it was Richard's experience that guided them through the process. Michael often looked to him for advice on strategy and how to frame their argument. They discussed everything in detail, crafting a narrative that they hoped would move the court. One of the most important pieces of their strategy was focusing on James's mental state at the time of the murder. Richard wasn't trying to claim that James wasn't guilty. There was no escaping the facts. What Richard needed to do was show the court that James had acted out of a moment of rage and fear, not premeditated malice. He wasn't a criminal by nature. He was a man who had made a horrific decision in the heat of an argument, a man who regretted it deeply. The day of the trial arrived. Richard could feel the nerves in his stomach. This was it. The courtroom was filled with people. James's family, the victim's family, reporters, and various members of the community who had heard about the case. Richard took a deep breath as he walked to the defense table, sitting beside Michael. Across from him, the prosecutor sat, looking confident, almost certain of victory. The evidence was stacked against James, but Richard wasn't ready to surrender. As the judge called the court to order, Richard stood up to give his opening statement. He took a moment to gather his thoughts. The eyes of the courtroom were on him, waiting for what he would say. Richard had to make them see James not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a man who had made a tragic mistake. He had to make them understand that justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about compassion and understanding the human side of the law. "Your Honor," Richard began, his voice steady, "the case we present here today is not about denying the facts. James Harper did, in fact, take the life of his wife, Claire Harper. The evidence is clear, and he has admitted to it. But what you need to understand What we ask you to see is that this act was not born out of malice, nor was it premeditated. James Harper is not a murderer by nature. He is a man who found himself pushed beyond his limits, a man who made a terrible, irreversible mistake. He paused, looking at the jury. I ask you to consider what drove James to this point. He had lost his job, his marriage was falling apart, and he felt hopeless. He did not plan this crime. He acted in a moment of rage, of fear. It was not a cold-blooded killing. It was a tragic mistake that he will live with for the rest of his life. Richard continued, telling the jury about James's character before the crime, about his struggles with his marriage, his financial troubles, and the pressure he had been under. He described James as a father who loved his children, a man who had always tried to do right by his family, but who had lost his way in the face of overwhelming stress and emotional pain. The man standing before you today, Richard concluded, is not the same man who committed this crime. He is a man who is deeply remorseful. He is a man who has spent every waking moment since that night wishing he could undo what he has done. The law calls for justice, yes, but it also calls for compassion. We ask you to consider what James Harper can become if given the opportunity to atone for his mistake, if given the chance to redeem himself. The prosecutor stood next, launching into a well-rehearsed argument about the brutality of the crime, the evidence against James, and the impact of his actions on Claire's family. The prosecutor's words were sharp, emphasizing the cold nature of the crime and the fact that James had no excuse for his actions. It was clear that the prosecution had no intention of showing any leniency. The trial continued for several days, with witnesses testifying and both sides presenting their evidence. As expected, the prosecution had a strong case, and Richard's defense was met with skepticism. But Richard didn't give up. He called in a psychologist who testified that James had been experiencing severe stress and emotional turmoil at the time of the murder. The psychologist explained how the human brain could react under extreme emotional pressure, leading to a loss of control. Richard also brought in James's children, who spoke about their father's character before the tragedy. They painted a picture of a man who had always been loving and caring, but who had fallen apart under the weight of his personal struggles. Richard could see the jury reacting to this testimony. They weren't just hearing about a man who had committed a crime. They were hearing about a man who had suffered, who had been broken by the pressures of life. As the defense rested its case, Richard felt a mixture of exhaustion and hope. He had done everything he could. Now it was up to the jury. The jury deliberated for hours. Richard waited nervously, his fingers tapping on the desk. He wasn't sure what the outcome would be. He had done everything possible to show that James deserved a chance at redemption, but the final decision was out of his hands. Finally, the jury returned to the courtroom. The judge called the room to order, and the foreman stood up to deliver the verdict. Richard's heart raced as he listened intently. We, the jury, find the defendant, James Harper, guilty of second-degree murder. There was a pause. Richard felt a knot tighten in his chest. Second-degree murder. It wasn't the acquittal he had hoped for, but it wasn't the life sentence either. It was a verdict that acknowledged the crime, but also took into account the circumstances surrounding it. It was a chance for James to one day rebuild his life. James sat in the courtroom, his head bowed in defeat, but there was a glimmer of relief in his eyes. He wasn't free, but he had been given a chance. Richard knew that James would serve time, but he would also have the opportunity to rehabilitate, to seek redemption. It was a small victory in a tragic situation. As Richard walked out of the courthouse that day, he felt a sense of closure. This was the final case of his career, and though the outcome wasn't perfect, he had done what he believed was right. He had fought for justice, not just the law, but for the human side of it. James Harper wasn't a perfect man, but he had been given a chance to make amends, and that, in Richard's eyes, was the truest form of justice. This was the last trial of Richard Manning's career, and as he left the courtroom for the final time, he knew he had made the right decision. Sometimes, the law wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about giving people the opportunity to change.